Royal Queen Seeds Interviews.
Welcome to a new episode of the Royal Queen Seed Interviews. Today, we chat with Brandon Allen, a professional chef, a partner of Trichome Institute, a cannabis education company, and certified entrepreneur. His mission is to educate the world about food through the use of cannabis. With a complete fascination for the endocannabinoid system, Chef Brandon has become an educational resource for the cannabis industry. Chef Brandon has recently filmed the Cooking with Cannabis course in partnership with the American Culinary Federation, and will be sharing some insight on cooking with cannabis in today's podcast. Hello, Brandon. How are you today?
I am doing fantastic. Hazel, how are you?
I'm actually very, very great and super looking forward to have you here today because our listener obviously don't know this, but I'm a huge fan of cooking, and having a cannabis chef here with us feels like it's a perfect moment for me to just get and ask you everything I want to know about edibles and cooking and cannabis and cooking.
Excellent. Well, fire away. Let's do this.
Perfect. So in the introduction, I've talked a little bit about you, and I'm sure I've botched this, so please correct me. And you are an entrepreneur.
Perfect. You nailed it. Entrepreneur. Yep.
Can you tell us a little bit?
Sure.
Yeah.
So to start, it's a made-up word, okay? So think of it as you are interpreting terpenes.
Yes.
So interpreneur. And of course, you can enunciate the terp in there if you care to. So interpreting was created by my business partner, Max Montrose. He's the founder of Trichome Institute, of which I'm a partner of. And interpreting is best described as the art and science of the cannabis sommelier. So an entrepreneur is a cannabis sommelier, and Max founded the first cannabis sommelier program when he started Trichome Institute over almost 8 years ago now. And basically, an entrepreneur has the ability to identify the quality and predict the psychotropic effects of marijuana. And so the idea here is just like a wine, a true sommelier has the ability to, smell and taste and look at wine and identify the type of grape, all the way sometimes down to the zip code of where it was actually cultivated, and even the year that it was of the vintage. A cannabis sommelier or an entrepreneur has the ability to identify a lot of the characteristics of cannabis flower.
Okay, that is very interesting, actually.
And as a chef, I know how to identify the difference between cilantro that you can hardly even smell and has no nose to cilantro that just smacks you in the face because of the pungency of the aroma profile. And I know the difference between a nicely ripened tomato versus not, or a really beautifully marbled ribeye steak versus one that's not. But as a chef, I had no idea about cannabis quality. And when I would go into the dispensary, when I moved to California, and even before when I was in Colorado, there's all these names and these vague categories, and whatever the dispensary you could tell was like kind of pushing out the door. But I had no idea, like, what am I consuming? So I started doing research about how to identify cannabis quality. I ended up coming across Trichome Institute through YouTube, watched a bunch of Max's videos, and then I ended up enrolling as a student. So what's great is I was a student of Trichome Institute, and about 1.5 years, 2 years later, I actually became a consultant and then a partner of the company. So the bottom line here is I learned about cannabis quality from a chef's perspective first.
Oh, wow. So it's a course, basically, what you offer.
Yes. Right now the course is online. There are two different ones. There's the professional interpreting course, which is online, and then there's the advanced interpreting course, which is in person. And that is something that we'll be having in mid to end of 2022. As you know, everything's been delayed because of the craziness of the world, but hopefully we'll be seeing people in person sometime in 2022.
Oh, that's great. Well, now let's dive a little bit more into your food and cannabis knowledge. So what are the advantages of edibles over smoked or vaped cannabis?
Sure. I would say that the number one advantage of an edible or any type of ingestible orally consumed cannabis product compared to something that's smoked or vaporized would be discretion.
Yeah.
It's so easy. You can be anywhere, and just like you could, pop a mint gum, a cough drop. I'm a little nasally right now.
Yeah.
Or just simply take a little bite of a snack. You can do the same thing with an edible. With that, there's no aroma, or I guess people think of the word odor as more of like a negative term. So, in that sense, there really is no odor to some people, or aroma, whatever it may be. And so with that, there's nothing to smell. There's nothing to see. There's no exhale. Even with a vape pen, believe me, I may or may not be guilty of being, let's say, maybe in a movie theater and taking a hit of my vape pen and then realizing that, oh my gosh, I just like created this plume, So discretion would definitely be the first thing. The next thing would definitely have to do with health concerns. We don't completely understand all of the things that are happening when you light something on fire and inhale it. There are plenty of studies that are done on other things that show that inhaling, combustible plant matter or anything that's includes like carcinogens, which when you light something on fire and you have that ash and the tar and all of that and the resin that builds up, I've been smoking much of my life. I smoked cigarettes for a very long time, which has been over a decade since I quit. And at the end of the day, if I find myself in situations where I'm smoking more often, because I cut back a lot, I end up finding that I'm more congested and that I'm clearing my throat and different things like that. So that's one side of it, is the smoking. But then there's the vaporization, or like dabbing. There have been studies that have shown that terpenes, specifically, that as some of them can break down, that they turn into acetone or benzene, which are two things that are not that great
healthy
to be inhaling. So we don't know the long-term effects, especially in the concentrate world. People have been smoking plants for forever. If it's something that's in moderation, I would say for the most part, as long as there's not bad things in it, like external things like pesticides and such, or certain molds, pretty sure it's fine. If you're smoking all day, every day, you might have some, lung issues in the future. It's possible. Is it possible that the cannabinoids and other compounds in the plant could mitigate some of those negative effects if they weren't there? Possibly. But at the end of the day, when it comes to these higher temperature, super concentrated forms of, extracts and hash and things like that, where the terpene content specifically does not represent the natural ratio of what would be found in the plant in its raw, dried and cured state. Could that be harmful? Possibly. And again, research has been done. I believe it was out of Colorado. A study was done on looking at different terpenes being vaporized at different temperatures. And then they're seeing all the different metabolites or derivatives of the original terpene. And some of them are not that great for us. So how much are you consuming? What terpene is it? How often do you need to consume it for it to be detrimental to your health? These are all things that are still, a big old question mark. But in a roundabout way, the two biggest advantages would be of an edible would be first discretion, and then the next thing is you're not being put in a position where you're wondering if what you're inhaling could be detrimental to your health. So I'm being very specific with my words of maybe, might, possibly, could. I'm not saying is or isn't or does or anything like that, because more research needs to be done on these things. So I don't want any diehard smokers, vapors, or dabbers to think that I'm talking shit on you right now. I'm not. All I'm saying is I've looked at the research, and there are definitely some things to consider.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Brandon. And the next one is, you are a chef, so obviously you have to test a lot of your recipes before you actually publish them, or even start to think to adding them to your anthology of recipes. So how do you properly dose cannabis in a recipe?
Sure.
Give us like the basic first thing that we have to do with it.
Well, the first thing you have to do is you have to identify where is your infusion coming from.
Yeah.
So understanding the amount of cannabinoid profile or whatever it may be, CBD, THC, and in this case for this interview, let's focus on THC.
Yeah.
Okay, CBD is psychoactive, but it is non-intoxicating. Okay,
Yeah.
If you take way too much CBD, which you can take a ton of it, it's not going to hurt you. There's been tons of studies showing that high doses of thousands of milligrams a day are totally fine. Okay,
Yeah.
so let's focus on THC. THC, can you overdose on it? Yes. It doesn't mean that you're going to die like a heroin overdose or something like that.
Yeah.
But in the sense of an overdose, when we're talking about that, I define a cannabis overdose as when you reach the state of discomfort.
Yeah.
Okay. So when you start to experience anxiety and paranoia and other things that are negative, that's an overdose as far as I'm concerned, because it's not a positive situation.
Yeah.
So when it comes to understanding how to properly dose something, you first must know how many milligrams of THC that you're starting with. So anytime you're doing like a flower infusion, it is impossible to know your dose. 100% impossible. I don't care what you read online, what the lab tests of the flower says, because that lab test does not represent the flower you have in your hand. It represents the flower that they tested. And buds on the same plant can have different potencies. Okay. So it all starts with the amount that you're starting with. So let's say in this instance for this question, we're utilizing a THC distillate, which is already decarboxylated, which means it's activated, which means that it's very easy to dose. So you can take a gram of, let's say, 90% THC distillate, which means that there would be 900 milligrams of THC in there. And you could take that and you could put it into whatever infusion base that you choose, whether it's a different type of oil, any type of fat, sometimes maybe honey or glycerin, alcohol. And you can say, okay, well, I'm going to dose this so that I have 900 milligrams of THC. So I'm going to put this in 900 milliliters of said infusion base.
Yeah.
So that equates to 1 milligram per milliliter. Or you could dose it so there's 10 milligrams per milliliter or 100 milligrams per milliliter. So first is just some basic math. That's what you're starting with, what you're combining it with, and then what does that equate to based on the measurement. So that is the first thing whenever you're doing any type of recipe, is understanding your starting content, what the dose is, what you're adding that into, so you know what your dose is per milligram per milliliter. And your audience is much more familiar with metric than mine. I've gotten used to discussing milligrams and milliliters through cannabis, but for everyone who is used to teaspoons and tablespoons and things like that, think of it as a teaspoon is about 5 milliliters. A tablespoon is about 15. Okay, it's just under. It's like 14.89, something like that, but it's pretty damn close. So so you understand how you're dosing, and then you shift into what you're putting it into. If you have a chutney, a chunky chutney, or a salsa that is chunky and it's not blended and not pureed, and if you were to take 250 milliliters or about a cup, and you were to say, okay, well, I have this much of my chunky product, and I'm going to put 100 milligrams of THC in there, stir it around, and then I'm going to break this down. So there's going to be, I don't know, for the sake of not having to do my math in my head, let's say that you break it down to say that there's 2.5 milligrams of THC per tablespoon or 15 milliliters. Great. But the thing about it is that you have a chunky product.
Yeah.
How do you know per tablespoon, because you have chunks of tomato or mango or onion or whatever else may be in there? You don't know exactly how many milligrams are in there because it's not properly homogenized.
Yes.
Okay, it's not dispersed evenly. So in the sense of making an infusion, I always recommend for a recipe how you properly dose something. Again, start knowing your starting material, knowing your dose of your infusion base, and then blending it properly into a recipe. Okay. So making sure that your recipe base or whatever you're infusing is homogenized. That could be a soup that's blended. It could be a hot sauce or a blended salsa or chutney or something like that. It could be a whipped cream. It doesn't matter as long as it is properly homogenized. Now, in the sense of, let's say you have like this, a slaw that's got a bunch of chunky, full body ingredients in there, then how you would dose that is based on the individual serving. So basically, let's say that you have this mayo-based slaw and you infuse mayonnaise, something like that I would recommend is you make it individual, or what you do is you make your recipe that's not infused whatsoever, but you make your big batch because you're serving, 50 people, and you want to include this little slaw. And basically you take your slaw and you're going to say that's what's infused. You would portion out how much is in there, and you would either put it in a bowl, infuse it, mix it around, and then serve it, or you simply put it on the plate, and then you take a little pipette with your super concentrated infusion and you just drop it on top.
Yeah.
Now, some people don't think that that's necessarily infusing food with cannabis, but at the end of the day, it's not necessarily how you infuse it. It's how the customer consumes it.
Yeah.
Okay. Or how the guest or your friend or family member consumes it. Because if you say there's 2.5 milligrams of THC in there, then there should be 2.5 milligrams of THC. That's ultimately what matters. So how you properly dose cannabis in a recipe is understanding your cannabinoid profile, making sure it is dosed in your infusion base properly, making sure it's homogenized or added to a thicker recipe, a chunky recipe in a way that is accurately dosed. So dosing at the end of the day when it comes to edibles is by far the most important thing, not so much how the cannabinoids got into that food.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So after this, I want to ask you if you think, on your personal experience with cooking with cannabis, if it's better cannabutter or THC, for the sake of this interview, infused oil.
Definitely oils. When you heat butter, once it gets, I believe, above about 190 Fahrenheit, the fat separates from all the other water-based ingredients.
Yeah.
Okay. Because butter is not 100% fat like oil, so to speak, is. Okay. So what happens is when you heat this, it separates. And that's why anyone who's made cannabutter at home, when you put it into the fridge and it firms up, and then what happens is you push the butter fat, which is called clarified butter or ghee, depending on how it's made. Let's just say clarified butter for now.
Yeah.
You have that water at the bottom, and then you drain that water out. So at the end of the day, you're actually not left with cannabutter.
Yeah.
You're left with canna ghee or canna clarified butter. You're left with butter fat. So when you have water in any type of extract medium, okay, what happens is you lose extraction efficiency because cannabinoids are alcohol or water soluble. And I do apologize. There's probably going to be some lawnmower sounds. Hopefully you won't hear them. They're doing some landscaping right now. And by the way, if anyone is curious why there's like this C in a big window, I live full time in a motorhome with my wife. She's a travel nurse and we travel all over the country. So I'm sitting here. I'll give you a little pan there. There's the front cabin there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Canna chef on the move.
Right, exactly. Oh, there we go. Okay. So when you are doing an infusion base with anything that has, I think I pulled that over a little too far. There we go. So when you're, pause for a second, let you edit anything out. So when you're doing an infusion with anything that has a high water content, like butter, or a low proof alcohol, like everyday vodka or whiskey that you get at the bar, there's water in there. So the extraction efficiency significantly decreases. Okay.
Yeah.
So if you're doing a butter infusion base versus an oil infusion base, the oil infusion base is going to have a higher extraction efficiency because it doesn't have the water in there. So let's say you make butter, and at the end of the day, you separate that water, which is going to have a minimal amount of cannabinoids in there because that water can't extract it. You're left with this very hard, especially out of the refrigerator, clarified butter or ghee. So what I recommend is someone wants to make a legitimate cannabis butter is that you actually start with clarified butter or ghee. Do your infusion there because now you're dealing with 100% fat. Now there are few other things in there, but for the sake of this, it's close to 100% fat. So can you hear that at all?
Very, very lightly.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, I think we'll be fine.
All right,
I'll
great.
let you know if it goes too loud.
Okay. So what I recommend is if anyone wants to make an infused butter, they actually start with ghee or clarified butter. Now you have a much higher fat percentage that will be, almost 100%.
Yeah.
And the extraction efficiency goes up significantly, and you can make your infusion. Then what you do is let that ghee or clarified butter sit at room temperature, okay, and be very malleable, okay? So from there, what you would do is then add a little bit of cream, generally about 10 to 15% of the original volume you started with the ghee. And what you would do is then emulsify that cream back into the butter or back into the ghee, and you'll actually be left with a butter-like consistency because now you're re-homogenizing that water-based ingredient and kind of creating butter again. And in something like that, when you're looking for like a spreadable butter type of consistency, it'll work. It might be a little bit more granular than just the regular butter itself. But when it comes to making different recipes and they call for butter, you can adjust that recipe because what butter is water and fat. And generally butter is, roughly 20% water, 15 to 20% water. It depends on the style of butter. So, if you have a recipe and it calls for X amount of butter, then you should be able to kind of step back and do a little bit of math and say, okay, well, I can put this much ghee and then maybe a little extra water, milk, or cream, or whatever else is in that recipe to balance that out. But at the end of the day, the majority of butter-based recipes are baked goods. And when it comes to making baked goods, I actually don't recommend infusing baked goods because when you are adding cannabinoids, reintroducing them to heat after they're decarboxylated and activated, heat above let's say 300 Fahrenheit or so, will start to rapidly degrade the cannabinoids after a few minutes. So you can go through all this trouble of making sure you're dosing and recipes are homogenized properly and whatnot, and think that you're getting 10 milligrams of THC in your cookie or brownie or cupcake. But you could actually end up with a lot less than that because of the degradation that happens. So any type of baked good type of recipe that's being infused, unless, again, it's a manufactured thing that they've got it down to a science, they know exactly what they're doing, they're all lab tested. What I recommend is actually infusing your garnish, like your filling for your cupcake or your icing for your brownie or something else that would then be added to that baked good after it's already cooked.
Yeah, no, that makes sense on it. Like you don't want to process it too much or else you end up like degrading it, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's like if you're going to pay or go through all the, let's say you're just growing at home, which many people listening I'm sure are, why would you want to deteriorate all of your hard work and lose that THC? So, I look at any type of infusion outside of the decarboxylation process, which is heating it and activating it. Any type of infusion or incorporation into a recipe should have to the least amount of heat applied to that infusion base as possible, because you want to maintain as much of those cannabinoids as you can.
Yeah. And speaking about cannabinoid, we said that we are talking about THC simply because I'm sure the majority of our listeners are more interested in THC than CBD. And can you explain to us the function of 11-hydroxy THC and the relationship that they have with the CB1 receptor in our body. So a little bit of the difference between THC and 11-hydroxy, and then again, what that does to our body.
Sure, absolutely. When it comes to the various forms of THC, let's start from the beginning. So when you have a living cannabis plant, that plant has the ability to biosynthesize. So the plant has a genetic roadmap, so to speak, that creates THCA. Think of the A as acid or in its raw state, okay?
Yeah.
So the plant creates THCA. Through oxidation and sunshine and various forms of heat and UV light, that THCA can be converted into THC. Okay, so what happens is the carboxyl group, which is CO2, through this process of decarboxylation, evaporates off. Okay, and think of it as, I don't have any keys in front of me here. THCA does not have it does at a very low scale. It doesn't have the potency to activate CB receptors in a way because of its shape, okay?
Yeah.
But when you heat it and that carboxyl group evaporates off, the new shape of this compound is able to fit into the CB receptor, and not just fit into it, but unlock it.
Yeah.
Okay, because there are instances where certain compounds can bind to a cell receptor, but nothing happens. They just like are hanging out. It's like, have you ever had a key that you put into a lock but it doesn't turn?
Yeah.
It's like that. Well, THC that's been heated has the ability to fit and turn. Okay, and that's what makes you feel high is THC. So that process can happen in very small amounts in the living plant, as well as when you have your dried and cured flower, just being exposed to even room temperature in the elements, a little bit can decarboxylate naturally. Now, in order to really activate this, especially for an edible, you have to decarboxylate it, you have to heat it and create that full conversion, okay?
Yeah.
So when you are inhaling, so whether it's smoke or vapor, when you're inhaling THC, there's delta-9 THC and there's 11-hydroxy THC, okay?
Yeah.
When you inhale it, there's a lot of delta-9 THC that enters your system, and your lungs metabolize a tiny little bit of that delta-9 into 11-hydroxy THC. It's a very, very small amount, okay? But it does exist through inhalation. However, when you are digesting, so any form of THC that you're swallowing, okay?
Yeah.
What happens is your liver gets a hold of that delta-9, very similar metabolizing enzymes that are found in your lungs are also in your liver. And what happens, though, is it metabolizes a lot more of that 11-hydroxy. So what happens is you still do have delta-9 that enters your system, but you have a lot more of that 11-hydroxy THC that is now circulating throughout your body.
Yeah.
11-hydroxy THC is more potent than delta-9 THC, and it also has the ability to last a lot longer in the sense of the effects. Now, without getting into all the nuances of what is actually happening at the CB receptor,
of course, at
the end of the day, what happens is it's stronger and it lasts longer. And not only that, but it tends to come in waves for people, especially those that have a no to low tolerance to THC. Okay, you feel these like you're on a roller coaster ride. You know, for the most part, what happens with an inhalation high is the effects can sometimes be felt when you exhale. I mean, how great of a feeling is that? When you take a hit and you hold it just for a couple of seconds, and on the exhale, you immediately feel your brain and body changing. I think that's one of the greatest moments.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the peak onset effects generally happen within like 5 to 10 minutes. Okay, so you take your hit, and imagine we were like looking at some scientific chart here. And here we'll go from this side because that's kind of where it would come from. So what happens is you smoke, and it goes immediately up. It reaches its peak level, and then it kind of fades down like this over the course of, for most people, 2 hours.
Yeah.
maybe 3 or 4, especially now with some of the more potent flower. But for the most part, someone who has a tolerance to cannabis, they take a couple hits, smoke a half a joint or a whole joint, they're going to be high for a couple hours. Okay.
Yeah.
But the effects start to decrease pretty rapidly. After 10, 20, 30 minutes, you're definitely going downhill. Not in a bad way, but the effects.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, when you take an edible, what happens, it's almost the opposite. So it takes a very long time, anywhere from 30 at the lowest end for most people up to like 90 minutes for the effects to reach its peak level.
Yeah.
Sometimes the peak level could take 2 to 3 hours because it kind of comes and goes. And then what happens is, for a lot of people, is the chart starts looking like this.
Yeah.
It's just this roller coaster of experience, and it could last anywhere from 4, 6 plus hours depending on your dose.
Yeah.
My first edible, I was high the next morning still.
Yeah.
So it's just the way it is. So that would be the differences between the different forms of THC and how they affect you being different as well.
Yeah. And speaking about your first time, can you tell us some rookie mistakes that some people might do, or that you have done in the past as well?
Sure. Well, here's my experience. I've been smoking since I was a young teenager, and in and out, throughout my life in different areas that weren't always legal. But whatever. I enjoyed the herb.
Yeah.
So I was used to it. I'd enjoy getting high, and there was times where I get pretty freaking baked, and it's like, whatever, you go to sleep, no big deal.
Yeah.
Well, my first edible high, I just moved to Denver, Colorado. So I went from almost sea level. Where I was at in Pennsylvania was probably 1,000 feet or less in elevation. And then I go to Denver, which is the mile high city, 5,000 plus feet.
Yeah.
And so that alone creates some pretty interesting changes. But I go to a dispensary, and it was my first time in a legal situation. And I told the guy, I said, I've never done an edible before. What would you recommend? He's like, well, what do you like? And I said, whatever. It's like, I want to try an edible.
Yeah.
Oh, well, this root beer soda over here was ranked like the best edible in Colorado for how many years? I said, okay. I said, well, how much do I take? He said, well, it's 10 milligrams, and you've never done an edible before. So drink half, and in 30 minutes, if you don't feel anything, drink the other half. So that's what I did. Got home. My now wife, Megan, so girlfriend at the time, we're getting all ready. We're watching, got some movies lined up. I had like 2 glasses of wine, which I wouldn't recommend doing either for your first time edible experience. I drank half. I waited 30 minutes, and I didn't feel anything. So I did what he said, and I drank the other half. And then about 20 or 30 minutes later, I started to feel high. And I felt great. I mean, I was fantastic. Well, about 20 to 30 minutes after that second dose that I took kicked in.
Yeah.
And I went from feeling great to like overwhelmed. And I remember sitting on this sofa we got on Craigslist because we were doing her travel nursing. We were living in apartments, and we get this like old school wooden anyway. And I'm sitting there, and I'm like lounged back, and my whole body is like, whoa,
Yeah.
And I look over at Megan. I said, I am really high right now. It's like, please just don't mess with me.
Yeah.
Just leave me be. And what she do, she leans over and she starts tickling me, which is innocent. But I went from really high to out of my mind. Like,
Yeah.
I was gone. I started getting paranoid. My heart's beating out of my chest. I'm like, I didn't feel like I was unsafe at that time, but I definitely felt very uncomfortable,
Yeah.
So I listened to what the guy said to do, which was totally wrong. Totally wrong.
Yeah.
So when it comes to your first couple of times doing an edible,
Yeah.
everyone says low and slow with
Yeah.
edibles, but they're not very specific. So the first thing is you need to know the dose of what you're consuming. If your friend says, hey, I've got a pot brownie for you, or a cookie, or anything homemade,
Yeah.
and if they say that there's like 10 milligrams in here, chances are there could be 50, there could be 100, there could be 5, there could be 2. You have no idea.
Yeah.
Okay. Especially if it came from a flower infusion. Now, if they're used to making edibles and they're using decarboxylated cannabinoid concentrates, like a distillate of sorts, and they say, listen, I've done all the math and this and that, and I'm pretty damn confident that there's only 5 milligrams in here. If you have that type of an approach, that's a different experience. But
Yeah.
for let's look at this for especially for the legal market right now in many areas where people are looking at cannabis as either a substitute for recreational things like alcohol, or they're looking at it from a medicinal standpoint, or they're
Yeah.
just curious and they want to try and they want to have a good experience because they hear what's all the buzz about. You want to make sure that their edible dose is dosed properly. So that's the first thing. The next thing is what I, as well as Trichome Institute, we recommend is a 2.5 to 5 milligram dose of THC max within a 24-hour period.
Yeah.
So if you take 2.5 milligrams or 5 milligrams, that's your range, and you don't feel anything after 30, 40, 50, 100, however many minutes, it doesn't matter. Do not take more. And the reason why is because everyone's metabolism and liver health can vary. Not significant. There's extremes always, but for the most part, the majority of people fall into this category of like, we're all in a similar boat here. It's kind of how it goes with a lot of physiological processes of the body. Okay, we're all pretty damn similar. A lot of people say, oh, everyone's endocannabinoid system is different. Possibly, but to what degree? For the most part, we fit into here, but there's always the few that fall under the world of extremes. So most people do metabolize things the same, but if you don't feel anything after, regardless of what the period of time is, don't consume more. It's that simple. Don't wait till the next day, and then increase your dose by 2.5 milligrams.
Yeah.
So if you took 5, then I would recommend then taking 7.5.
Yeah.
See how you feel. Next day or next experience, if you didn't get the effect you're looking for, then work your way up to 10. For the most part, the majority of people who take an edible for the first couple of times will definitely feel high from 5 to 10 milligrams of THC.
Yeah.
And I guarantee you there's someone right now that's rolling their eyes and they're like, I take 100 or 200 or 300 milligrams, and like, okay, good for you.
Yeah.
Good for you. But you have a tolerance to it, but for new people, when it comes to edibles, which is the question, newbie mistakes, it's low and slow, 2.5 to 5 milligrams at a time, work your way up in 2.5 milligram increments. And if you don't know the dose, keep in mind that size does not matter.
Yeah.
I've got my seltzer water here. Okay. I could give someone this, and I could say, drink all of this, and there could be 2 milligrams of THC in it, and I could give someone a little cough drop or a candy or something like that, or a little bite of a cookie, and there could be 30 milligrams in that. So size does not matter.
Yeah.
So for the world that is listening that falls into this gray or black market of the cannabis industry, and you don't have access to, accurately dosed and lab tested edibles and things like that, what I would recommend in that case is, if you're new to cannabis, get used to inhaling it for a while before you go down the route of an edible, even though they could be very different, because you could take an OG that smokes every day for 30, 40 years and then give them their first edible and they'll be high out of their skull, because it's a completely new experience, because it's a completely different dominant compound or drug or active ingredient that is provoking those effects.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Brandon. And
sure thing.
Hopefully there are people taking notes right now of the first edible experience. Can you tell us a little bit the best way to retain terpenes when cooking with cannabis?
Yeah, don't worry about it.
Yeah.
No, really, don't worry about retaining terpenes with cannabis. So the terpenes are in like everything almost. There's terpenes in my seltzer water here.
Yeah.
Okay. It's tangerine, mandarin orange flavored. If you've been cooking, you're already a terpene master. If you've worked with fresh basil, or basil, should I say, oregano, citrus, any type of lemon or orange or lime zest, anything like that, you've been working with terpenes forever.
Yeah.
So the reason I say don't worry about terpenes is because the effects of terpenes in an edible do not represent the effects of terpenes through an inhalation high.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's no such thing. Okay. So in the world of cannabis, we talk about indica and sativa, or sedative to stimulating, because indica and sativa are really vague and kind of, they don't matter anymore. They haven't mattered for a very long time. Everything falls under sativa speciation wise, but then there are different varieties and or subspecies and varieties, and all of that doesn't really matter because all these plants are so hybridized. What matters is what you're consuming. Does it have a sedative or stimulating effect, or somewhere in between? Okay. So let's say that you have some OG Kush that generally has more of a sedative. Some people say it has a sedative body, but opening mind type of experience. Regardless, it doesn't matter what it's called. Let's say you have a sedative OG type, okay?
Yeah.
And you smoke that, and it relaxes you, and it gives you couch lock, and it makes you fall asleep. Great. What's happening there is you're getting an entourage, the combination of effects from the cannabinoids and the terpenes together that are provoking that effect. So let's say you're smoking it. So you're lighting this on fire, and then you're immediately inhaling that smoke or vapor, and it's having these effects. Okay. So think of it as when you light something or vaporize something, the heat is changing those terpenes, just like heat changes THCA to THC. And then baking your cookie long in the oven could then actually change that THC into other things like CBN, which takes quite a bit to happen, or other unknown compounds, but you're changing things. So heat matters. Okay.
Yeah.
So when you are lighting terpenes on fire, they're different from what was in that original plant. And then you're immediately inhaling them. Okay. So terpenes are very, and by immediately inhaling them, you're essentially capturing them before they can escape. All right.
Yeah.
So when it comes to decarboxylating cannabis flower or a concentrate, even at the lowest temperature, since terpenes are much more volatile or sensitive to heat compared to cannabinoids, they evaporate much faster. Okay. Or they deteriorate, or they turn into other things much faster. Okay. So what happens is that when you take your flour or concentrate and you decarb it in your oven or air fryer or toaster oven or whatever it may be, that heat is changing the chemical structure of those terpenes, and a lot of it's being evaporated, and it's not being captured immediately through your inhalation. They're disappearing. Okay. So if you were to take two cannabis varieties or strains that smell and look totally different, you decarb them in your oven, and then you pull them out and you let them cool, and about 10 minutes later, they're going to smell near identical.
Yeah.
And the reason why is those terpenes have evaporated out. So the first part to an edible experience with terpenes is you lose the majority of them.
Yeah.
Now, the next thing that happens, and I'll kind of speed this up without going down too much of a rabbit hole, but there's research to show that your stomach acid drastically changes the terpenes. So what it does is it'll take, say, linalool, found in lavender, and generally more calming instead of effects through inhalation, even aromatherapy, and that linalool will then be turned, so it's one terpene linalool, which is different now compared to the linalool that was in the living plant or what you inhale. And then your stomach acid can turn that linalool into several other different forms of linalool. And then it goes through digestion, it gets to your liver, and then each one of these could then turn into different things.
Yes.
Not 5 each. I'm just using this for a visual example. So what happens is by the time you have linalool that is systemic, that it gets absorbed and is bioavailable to your body, do you have the right form of linalool or enough of that form of linalool to do anything?
Yeah.
So when it comes to an edible experience, the effects of the original flower that it came from or concentrate it came from don't represent the effects of the edible, because a lot of those terpenes are completely destroyed. Now, even if you were to go through the trouble of extracting terpenes, decarbing the cannabinoids, mixing them back together, kind of like what happens with a lot of vape pens or some edibles, even then, those terpenes are still going to undergo a bunch of degradation through digestion. Okay.
Yeah.
So So don't think of an edible and terpenes or any type of food that you consume with cannabis and terpenes as that it's going to produce a sedative to stimulating effect because of the terpenes. If there's caffeine and sugar or melatonin and chamomile that's in that, those things are going to have much more of a pull in the sense of sedative to stimulating versus the terpenes. And one of the people say, like, if you eat mango before you get high, it'll last longer and you'll get higher because there's myrcene in mangoes.
Yeah.
Well, there's hardly any myrcene in most mangoes if you look at the chemical constituents of the majority of mango varieties. And just because there's myrcene in mango and there's myrcene in cannabis doesn't mean that digesting the terpenes that are found in mango will do anything at all. And research has actually shown that myrcene and a lot of other terpenes don't interact with cannabinoid receptors or do anything to increase the effects of THC whatsoever. So when it comes to looking at terpenes in the sense of effects, is it possible that terpenes have physiological effects through digestion? Yes. Is it possible that they could reduce inflammation or help with various other things? Yes, it is possible if you have the right dose. And when you look at a lot of the studies that are done on terpenes through digestion, the doses are really high, or they're done on mice, or they're done in cell studies. They're not done in human beings. So what happens in a petri dish or a mouse doesn't necessarily mean it happens in a human. So to step back from all of that, what do terpenes do in a kitchen? The same as any other pantry or refrigerator ingredient you've got lying around. They affect the flavor, the aroma, and the mouthfeel of food. So terpenes are amazing to cook with. They're a lot of fun because you can totally change the flavor of food, sometimes without even affecting the aroma, depending on the terpene, or vice versa. You can affect the aroma of a dish without affecting the flavor, or you can do both. You can also affect the mouthfeel. Like there's like this fun cooling type of, not menthol-y, but like this cooling sensation that terpenes can provide and other mouthfeels, which are really cool. So think of terpenes as just like you would ginger or cayenne pepper or cilantro or anything else. You've been cooking with them forever. If you cook with plants, you've been cooking with terpenes. And you can use these isolated terpenes or naturally extracted terpene profiles from various plants, including cannabis, to change the experience when it comes to food. And again, it doesn't mean terpenes don't have any type of benefit. And I try and steer clear from medicinal things because I'm not a doctor. But there are medicinal benefits to a lot of plant compounds. But just because a study comes out that shows that limonene or linalool or apigenin or some flavonoid or any other plant compound, just because a study comes out that says that compound does this over here, it doesn't mean that if you eat it that it's going to do that, or that if you smoke it, it's going to do that, because there's so many other variables and what was that study done on, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So again, when it comes to terpenes, don't think of them as effects driven. Think of them as experience driven, based off of how you taste and smell and experience the flavor and aromas of food.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So looking at my clock, I think we are actually running out of time. And I'm sure we can, I could stay here forever talking about cooking and cannabis. So let's not do that, because not anyone else has 5 hours to spend with me and you today. But I think we can do a Cooking with Cannabis 2.0 with you, surely. And
Absolutely.
now, before we leave, I'd actually like to ask you some social media questions. We always post on our Instagram, @RoyalQueenSeed_RQS, and we ask before the episode if people are interested in the episode and if they want to ask you something. And we actually had tons of questions for you, so we picked 3 that we think you might help us with. So the first one is, we often make recipes/mixes with milk or butter. Are any other ingredients that I could use?
I am a huge fan of making infusions with extra virgin olive oil, avocado oil, and MCT oil, which is a fractioned coconut oil. And one of the reasons that I prefer those things is that they go well with a lot of the recipes that I prefer to cook. So I'm a huge carnivore. I've got a shirt on with steak cuts on it, as if anyone's noticed. So I'm a huge like meat guy, not even meat and potatoes, just meat. But I love my sauces and garnishes. So it's very easy to use extra virgin olive oil that's infused to make a really flavorful chimichurri, because I want that flavor to match that recipe. And then there's other times where it's great to have like avocado oil or MCT oil, which are very bland. They lack aroma and flavor, which is a good thing for a lot of recipes, to like make an infused mayonnaise or an aioli or things like that. So what I say when it comes to making infusions is you need to think about the final recipe before you make the infusion. Don't just start making butter or picking up some random oil. What are you going to make with that? And then go backwards from there. How is that infusion going to pair with the final recipe?
Yeah, right. Cool. So the second question is, and also, sorry, going back to the first one, could you tell us something that is even not like culinary, as in you were talking about glycerin and alcohol. Could we use those instead of anything like, dairy?
Absolutely.
Or just
yes.
Yeah.
So when it comes to infusion bases, you can use any type of fat or alcohol. Generally, if you're going to do alcohol, I recommend getting like 151 to 200 proof. Depends on where you live and your laws. Like where I'm at in the United States right now, I can order 200 proof ethanol alcohol that's food grade online shipped to my door. But if I went to the next state over, it's not allowed. It's like a 50-50 blend here in the United States. So it depends on your laws. But a lot of states, you can get like 120 to 151 proof alcohol just at the liquor store. The higher the proof, the higher the extraction efficiency. And you can use them in a concentrated form, and it's water soluble for the most part. And you can add that to recipes by dosing it accordingly without really affecting the flavor of your dish if you make it super concentrated. Glycerin and honey are kind of weird. First of all, if you're going to make a glycerin or a honey infusion, you want to start with a concentrate that's already extracted, because that way you decarb it and then you dissolve it into that glycerin or honey. Okay. I spoke with a lab recently. They said that they tested glycerin that was used to make a flour extraction, and they tested 0 cannabinoids in it whatsoever.
Wow.
And then I've also noticed it with honey. Again, saying honey is like saying water.
Yeah.
Or beer. There's a lot of different types and different elements of it. Water's probably a bad example. Let's say beer, anywhere from the Miller Lite all the way to the Imperial Stout. There's a lot of variants and different types. So honey, there's different types and ways that they're processed. And what I've noticed with honey is that at times I'm worried about homogenization. I'm worried about separation of the cannabinoids because they're not technically dissolvable in it. They might mix and suspend in the honey because of the thickness, the consistency of it, but it's not as good or as proper of a homogenization as fat or alcohol would be. And even comparing fat to high alcohol, even some lower proof alcohols, you can experience some separation. So at the end of the day, working with concentrates across the board is a lot better because you're dissolving. You're not having to worry about extraction efficiency, which for flour is very, very low. And yes, there are other things that you can use to make infusions, depends on where you're coming from. But just be very mindful of homogenization when you're dealing with any type of water-based ingredient like glycerin or honey.
Right. Thank you so much, Brandon. Second question is, what can we do if we're experiencing a bad trip with cannabis edibles?
Great question. And it's a great question because I'm glad that people are talking about the fact that this is a reality. A lot of people like to act like cannabis is, the greatest thing on the face of the planet. There's nothing wrong with it. It's for every single person. It's just not the case. Cannabis as a whole is very vague to say. Specifically, THC is not for everyone, especially at higher doses. So what provokes any type of bad trip, as they explained, or period of overconsumption, paranoia, anxiety, etc., is generally going to be THC in its various forms that can come from it. So the biggest thing is time, which unfortunately not everyone likes to wait for. So outside of time, when it comes to having a bad experience, distractions. Seriously, distractions are the greatest thing. Call someone. Say, listen, I am high AF right now, and I want to talk to you about anything. Just keep me on my mind going. That's a good thing. A deck of cards. See how many times I've gotten too high and I've played solitaire, even on my phone. Something that requires engagement and a mental engagement, more so than physical. But distractions are key. Some people can watch a movie if they're too high, and that's a distraction. Not me. If I watch a movie or something that I'm separate from, that I'm not engaged in, I started getting bad anxiety from too much THC recently. Things changed. I used to have hair up here, not here. So like my experience with cannabis has changed quite a bit. My tolerance has changed quite a bit, and I'm sure it'll change again as I age and my health changes. But at the end of the day, distractions are key. In preventing it from happening in the first place, I guess is the ultimate thing. But a lot of people say that if you're too high to take CBD and it'll bring you down, or to suck on black peppercorns because it's nonsense. In the CBD world, there's no research that I've been able to find, and I look at CBD research all the time through Google Scholar, PubMed, and the various other medical journal publication sites out there. There's no research that I found that shows that taking CBD after mitigates the effects. Because without getting too technical, CBD doesn't have the ability to come in and like flick THC off the receptor. Okay. It does have the ability to mitigate some of the effects of THC, but all of the research shows that in order for that to happen, that CBD must be consumed before or at the same time as the THC, and generally in higher ratios. So you need this much CBD to that much THC. Now, placebo effect is amazing. It's probably my favorite drug that there is, which is the mind over matter. You have the ability to create your own reality. And there's so much research on placebo. It's fascinating. Even placebo versus placebo studies, where they've given different groups placebos, but how they talked about the drug had different effects, even though they were both placebos, is fascinating. So because of so much, I'm going to say, misinformation in the industry, a lot of things happen to people because they believe it's going to happen. So it's one of those weird things. Like if you're too high and you take some CBD, could it help you? Maybe. Is it the CBD? Well, based on the research thus far, it doesn't indicate that. Could it be because that's what you believe? Most likely. Is that the distraction? Could be. So at the end of the day, if you feel better, that's ultimately what matters. But the best thing to mitigate any type of anxiety, bad trip, or paranoia or anything like that from too much THC is don't take too much THC. And if you do, the biggest thing is kind of have this. Max, my partner, he has this thing he calls it the note to self, where for any new consumer that, especially engaging with edibles, he says, write a note to yourself. Says, dear Brandon, you're high right now. You might be a little uncomfortable. Well, that's okay. You're going to get over it. You're not going to die. You're not going to be harmed. Just take a moment, breathe, think about what could be provoking that anxiety in the first place, or take a walk, call your mother, whatever the case may be, do something to relax and realize that this will be over soon. You're going to be totally fine. Now, I don't know how many people are writing note to selves before they get high, but mentally have that note to self that if you're experiencing an overdose, a state of discomfort, as I define it, with THC, you're going to be fine. You're going to be fine.
Right. And lastly, someone is asking, can you give us a gummy recipe without lecithin? I think maybe they get online, there are a lot of them with lecithin. I believe maybe for to make it more homogenous, I think.
Homogenized.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's supposed to help with how it's homogenized. I am not a sweets guy.
Yeah.
I don't do gum. I've actually never made a gummy because I don't eat them regularly.
Yeah.
I've had infused gummies because it was like the only thing. But personally, I don't eat sweets.
Yeah.
I'm a big savory guy. So as a cannabis chef, I don't do confections and candies and things like that. Um, and on the sweet side, my formulas for infusing are still based off of homogenization, like a nice
Yeah.
panna cotta, and I'll infuse that. Anyway, so I know that from speaking with a lot of other cannabis chefs, the way they go about dosing their gummies
Yeah.
is they will make their mixture and then they will add an alcohol-based infusion or an MCT infusion or something like that into each gummy or into the batch as a whole.
Right.
So you can use an alcohol base. Depending on the gummy recipe, you might be able to use an MCT oil, which would have to be pretty potent.
Yeah.
I get why people like gummies. I mean, there's gummy bears since a kid. We've been, take your medicine through the gummy,
Yeah.
but it's really not a big thing for me. I know some people are using a pectin base, which is evidently helps with some stability that's in there. Depending on where you live, you might even be able to get some water soluble THC, which is definitely going to be in a legal state unless you've got a friend type thing.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, folks, when it comes to dosing or taking an edible, it could be as simple as putting a tincture in your mouth out of a dropper. So I wish I had a better answer for the gummy thing, but think of it this way: as to the chefs that are out there,
Yeah.
As a cannabis chef, and maybe we'll end up closing with this, maybe not. One of the bits of advice that I like to give is stick to what you are good at and stick to what you love. Okay, so if you're a cannabis chef or even a home cook, okay, any type of cook, and you love making tacos, which is like my thing, make tacos.
Yeah.
If you're not good at Italian food or making borscht, then don't.
Yeah.
Stick to what you love. So I, again, am not the sweet guy. So that is why I don't like to provide too much guidance, so to speak, when it comes to the sweets and the candies and the confections, because there's a lot of other cannabis chefs that know a lot more about that. So I like to stay in my lane for that. So I wish I had a better answer for you. Maybe you have another question we can wrap up on. But, at the end of the day, know to stay in your lane. I think that's important.
Well, to end then, and this is a question from me, it's which then savory recipe you find is the easiest to infuse?
Anything that is high oil content that requires blending.
Yeah. So
one of my
mayo
favorite things
and condiments, that kind of stuff.
Exactly. Condiments are really simple. Anything fat based is like super, super simple.
Yeah.
I'm a huge fan of garnishes and that it's like sauces and whatnot. So one of the recipes I make all the time is I call it a limonene chimichurri. So a lot of chimichurri, which some people may not be familiar, it's basically an oil-based sauce that, depending on where you're at, it's either with minced herbs and garlic and other flavoring agents that is then just kind of stirred together, and it's not homogenized, or it's blended. I like to make mine blended, and I add limonene, which is a terpene in it, which is very citrusy and has great flavor and great aroma profile, and goes amazing with the oregano and parsley and garlic and other things that are in the recipe. And I'll actually give you the recipe if you want to feature it within the site here. And it goes great on like any type of protein. And then I blend it so that it gives it a thicker nappe, which means the consistency or the texture is thicker compared to just like the minced herb and the oil that just kind of runs off. So it's a lot easier. So if I were to put like a tablespoon that has 5 milligrams of THC on some shrimp or some steak or anything like that, it's going to hold on to that protein. It's not just going to drain off and run off onto the plate. As a chef or a cook, you want to make sure that you're not wasting your infusions.
Absolutely.
So when you're thinking about your final recipe, is that infusion going to just be left on an empty plate because it's just smeared all over? Or is it going to hug the food? Or if you have a more liquid, runny type of infusion, what are you giving your guests or friend or family member to mop it up with? Are they getting some bread and everything like that? So I'm a huge fan of infusions, again, that have a high fat type of content in the recipe, because that's personally how I eat. And I love making different sauces and garnishes and whatnot that have that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, our time is up for today, Brandon, but it's been an incredible chat. I already knew that we were going to have an incredible chat about food because, food, people, cannabis, I feel is always connecting. So we thank you so much for coming in here today. And I'm sure that we will have, a Cooking with Cannabis 2.0 where we get you again here. And maybe, I don't know, maybe you can teach me some more tricks and tips about cooking with cannabis.
I've got a few more to share, that's for sure. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
No worries. Have an incredible day, Brandon, and we'll see you soon.
Cheers.
Bye.